Just before breakfast on the morning of March 11th, Private Albert Mitchell, a mess cook in the U.S. Army, reported to the hospital at Camp Funston, Fort Riley, Kansas, complaining of the cold-like symptoms of sore throat, fever, and headache. By noon, over 100 of his fellow soldiers had reported similar symptoms, marking what are believed to be the first cases of the historic influenza epidemic and later pandemic of 1918. While there are various hypotheses regarding how the epidemic started, one of the most common says that there was a strain of the influenza virus in pigs that were being bred at the camp for food. Over the past 100 years, as scientific research methods have improved, other seemingly credible versions of the story have come forward. Unfortunately, there is no conclusive answer. According to a history of the epidemic, quote, the outbreak of the disease reported at Fort Riley in March was followed by similar outbreaks in Army camps and prisons in various regions of the country. The disease soon traveled to Europe, with the American soldiers heading to aid the Allies on the battlefields of France. In March 1918 alone, 84,000 American soldiers headed across the Atlantic. Another 118,000 followed them the next month. Once it arrived on the second continent, the flu showed no signs of abating. 31,000 cases were reported in June in Great Britain. The disease was soon dubbed the Spanish flu due to the shockingly high number of deaths in Spain, some 8 million it was reported, after the initial outbreak there in May 1918. The flu showed no mercy for combatants on either side of the trenches. Over the summer, the first wave of the epidemic hit German forces on the Western Front, where they were waging a final no-holds-bar offensive that would determine the outcome of the war. It had a significant effect on the already weakening morale of the troops. Meanwhile, the flu was spreading fast beyond the borders of Western Europe due to its highly contagious nature and the massive transport of men on land and aboard ship due to the war effort. By the end of the summer, numerous cases had been reported in Russia, North Africa, and India. China, Japan, the Philippines, and even New Zealand would eventually fall victim as well, end quote. Influenza made its way to Pennsylvania when a Navy ship from Boston, where an outbreak had already occurred, docked in Philadelphia. The first case of influenza was reported there on September 18, 1918. By the next day, 600 sailors were diagnosed, and the first civilian patients were arriving at area hospitals. According to author James Armstrong, Philadelphia was about to become the American city with the highest, most rapidly accumulating death toll in the worst epidemic in recorded history. The next day, the Elmira Star-Gazette reported, quote, Spanish influenza, or flu for short, seems to be invading this country. Local outbreaks have been reported in Alabama, Virginia, Mississippi, New York, Cincinnati, and Massachusetts. It is feared that it may spread over the whole country. There is no apparent reason for calling this ailment Spanish rather than German or Russian or anything else. It is said to be the same old influenza or grip that has swept Europe and America time after time for centuries. It may vary a little from the usual strain, but the difference can hardly be appreciated except by experts. The best preventatives are, naturally, good nourishment, proper exercise, fresh air, and sleep. If they do not ward off the disease, they will lighten its effects. The attack, says Surgeon General Blue of the Public Health Service, comes suddenly. People are stricken on the street, while at work in factories, shipyards, offices, or elsewhere. First, there is a chill, then fever with temperature from 101 to 103. Headache, backache, reddening and running of the eyes, pains and aches all over the body, and general prostration. Persons so attacked should go to their homes at once, get to bed without delay, and immediately call a physician. The treatment is simple, consisting principally of rest in bed, fresh air, abundant food, with medicine for the relief of pain. Every case with fever should be regarded as serious, and the patient should stay in bed till the temperature becomes normal, end quote. One of the first references to the flu in the local newspapers appeared in the Daily Review on September 23, 1918, and reported that extensive epidemics of influenza had been reported in 4 military camps in the northeastern United States. A report in the newspaper from Pittsburgh 2 days later stated that Dr. Philip E. Marks, the superintendent of the Bureau of Infectious Diseases of the Department of Health, said, quote, "Spanish influenza is nothing more than old-fashioned grippe. Robust men are more susceptible in contracting the disease than members of the weaker sex. If persons will take care to sneeze into their handkerchiefs, there will be no danger of the germ spreading," end quote. This was a ridiculous statement, especially considering it was coming from the Bureau of Infectious Diseases. A more accurate view of what was to come occurred on October 2nd when the Daily Review ran an article about Dr. William Armstrong DeWitt, chief surgeon and head of the Blossburg State Hospital. Dr. DeWitt, a former Troy resident and widely known in Bradford County, died of pneumonia the day before. It is likely it made local residents take notice. After all, if a doctor, the head of a hospital, could die as a result of this epidemic, then maybe this was more serious than we thought. The public was notified that there was no occasion for panic, and to get panic-stricken at the thought or the approach of the epidemic is the worst thing anyone can do. The public was admonished to use ordinary horse sense in taking care of yourself, and if the flu strikes you, go to bed at once and call a doctor. Just 2 days later, the Elmira Star-Gazette carried a headline about Colonel Charles B. Hagedorn, a resident of Elmira and current acting commandant of Camp Grant at New Milford, Illinois. Colonel Hagedorn was in command of 42,000 soldiers. Influenza and pneumonia had caused the deaths of 500 men under Colonel Hagedorn's command, and he constantly worried about the epidemic in his camp. While these numbers were common in military camps at the time, Hagedorn was unable to come to terms with the climbing death rate that was occurring under his command. On October 7, 1918, Colonel Hagedorn retired to his quarters for the evening under a great deal of stress. He lay down on his bed, withdrew his pistol, and shot himself in the head. His body was found the next morning. News came from the nation's capital that influenza had invaded Washington, and all public meeting places were shut down. In Pennsylvania, public health officials were sent to Bethlehem to protect munitions workers there. Bethlehem was a major supplier of armor plate and ordnance to the U.S. Armed Forces during the ongoing war, including armor plate and large caliber guns for the Navy. A loss of manpower would certainly affect the war effort. It was reported, quote, "The entire medical, nursing, and pharmaceutical strength of the nation is being mobilized against it," end quote. The Daily Review reported that there were 1,500 cases of influenza in Pottsville, PA, meaning the epidemic was moving north toward Bradford County. The speed at which influenza was spread throughout both the United States and foreign countries was growing by the day, and health officials now saw the seriousness of what had become an epidemic. On October 6, 1918, although the county schools remained open, Towanda took it upon itself to institute a quarantine of all schools, churches, and other gathering places. Sayre took similar action the same day, closing down saloons and places of amusement, but unlike Towanda, leaving the closing of the schools up to the school directors and the superintendent of schools and the closing of the churches up to the clergy to make their own decisions. Newspapers reported that this was the first time in history that anyone could remember the churches being ordered to close as a result of an epidemic. Spreading with almost lightning speed, according to the press, 150,000 cases of influenza and thousands of deaths had already been reported to state authorities by October 8th. At this time, early cases of the flu were showing up in Towanda. In Sayre, the first death from an influenza case in Bradford County occurred October 7, 1918, at 8:30 p.m. at the Robert Packer Hospital. Only 22 years old, Mrs. George Sinzapaw contracted pneumonia while recovering from influenza and was taken to the hospital at 6 p.m., where she died. She left a husband and 2 children. Articles released by the State Department of Health and others began appearing locally on October 9, 1918, with the purpose of educating the public about influenza, its history, and the steps that should be taken in local communities and by households to combat the illness. Among the orders that came down was the prohibition of spitting, an offense that would get you arrested. The Wyalusing Rocket ran the following proclamation from the State Department of Health on October 9th, quote, "To the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Our Commonwealth is threatened by a serious epidemic of influenza, a highly communicable disease in which many cases develop into extremely fatal type of pneumonia. In order to as fully as possible protect the lives of our people as well as our essential war industries, the department has issued an order closing all theaters, moving picture places, amusement places, saloons, dance halls, and all unnecessary public gatherings, forbidding unnecessary visiting of the sick, and requiring all funerals, no matter what may have been the cause of death, to be private. For the public good, as well as your individual safety, the Department of Health calls upon all good citizens to help make this order effective. Avoid crowds and places frequented by large numbers of people. Stay at home and do not use the streetcars or trains except as your duties or employment may absolutely require. Crowded cars afford unusual facilities for spreading the disease. Make them less dangerous for those who must use them in necessary industry. Your hearty cooperation is necessary in this grave emergency. Wholesale liquor dealers, bottlers, fraternal organizations, and social clubs are requested to discontinue the sale, delivery, or serving of liquors for the period during which the hotel bars and saloons are closed. Compliance with this request is expected on the part of loyal dealers and patriotic organizations. Those who have been affected and in some instances greatly inconvenienced by the direct order are everywhere willingly and cheerfully obeying its requirements. Upon receipt of this order, the Towanda Board of Health called a special meeting the same day and passed the following resolution, quote, "It is ordered that all public and private schools and Sunday schools be closed until further action and notice, and that all public gatherings of any kind, social or otherwise, are prohibited," end quote. The board also made the closures listed by the State Department of Health mandatory and suggested that, if necessary, placard all doors leading to these places, quote, "closed by the order of the State Commissioner of Health," end quote. The communities of Sayre, LeRoysville, Rome, and Camptown were expected to take the same action soon. Hearing that liquor would not be sold during the period of the quarantine, Sonny Jones of South Warren headed out to stock up. On his way home, having imbibed too freely, he became drowsy, stopped the car along the road, and mistaking the highway for his own bed, he exited the vehicle, removed his shoes, and lay down on the highway using his shoes as a pillow. Here, he fell asleep. Shortly afterwards, a car came along the same road and slowed down when they saw the parked vehicle, but saw nothing of Sonny Jones until the car ran over a dark object, nearly causing an accident. When the car came to a stop, the passengers found Jones unconscious with injuries to his neck and back. 2 days later, he was taken to the Robert Packer Hospital for treatment and survived. In Sayre, Robert Fitzgerald, a yard conductor for the Lehigh Valley Railroad, quote, "dropped as though he's been shot through the heart," end quote. He worked during the night and at 8 a.m. went to the westbound yard office to report off duty. He filled out a time card and then turned and walked away from the office. After going a short distance, he suddenly fell to the ground. The Robert Packer Hospital ambulance was summoned, and it was discovered that Fitzgerald had influenza. The same day, Sayre closed the schools due to 5 teachers and 350 children being absent as a result of influenza. Almost immediately, all churches, ice cream parlors, and other related places were ordered closed, and all public meetings were postponed. Already, Dr. D. Leonard Pratt, Health Commissioner for Bradford County, reported 30 cases of influenza of a severe nature in Towanda and many more of a less severe nature. The northern part of the county had already seen 1 death and over 200 cases of a serious nature. In the southern part of the county, there were 5 cases reported in Rummerfield, 1 in Camptown, 1 at South Hill, and 1 at Durrell. Patients at South Hill and Durrell were also suffering with bronchial pneumonia. Only a few cases were reported in western Bradford County, and it was believed that the epidemic would not spread there. Dr. Pratt requested that all county physicians report to him all new cases of influenza so he could, in turn, report to the state an accurate daily number. The Canton Sentinel gave notice on October 10th that a quarantine was in effect and that churches, lodge meetings, and civic societies were not permitted to meet. The schools were closed and the Crawford Theater was shut down. Known for its tongue-in-cheek humor, the Sentinel added, quote, We have not examined the proclamation carefully, but we do not think it prohibits a young man from calling on his intended wife Sunday evening. As a precautionary measure, however, we would suggest that each wear a gauze mask during the call." End quote. Suggesting ways to fight off the flu, the Sentinel made it clear, quote, "This disease is one thing that whiskey will not cure," end quote. And for those people that were convinced that the Germans were to blame for the epidemic, the Sentinel reassured them with the statement, quote, "Don't get nervous or excited. The Germans cannot bottle up germs and then scatter them from airships," end quote. This was likely a reference to German efforts at that time to dabble with biological warfare during the First World War. The reported journal listed the 8 don'ts to prevent the spread of influenza. Number 1, don't congregate in crowded places. Number 2, don't use common towels or drinking cups. Number 3, don't fail to wear clothing according to the temperature of the day. 4, don't allow yourself to become fatigued. 5, don't sleep with the windows closed. 6, don't cough or sneeze without using the handkerchief. 7, don't work, among others, when you have a severe cold. And 8, don't treat a cold yourself. Despite these recommendations, numerous companies sought to capitalize on the epidemic by selling over-the-counter medicines that were intended to somehow assist those recovering from the flu. These are some examples. Condens catarrhal jelly for cold, sneezing, cough, catarrh, a buildup of mucus in the nose or throat, headache, sore nose, etc. Hill's Cascara quinine bromide for common colds, for headaches due to constipation, breaks up a cold in 24 hours, relieves grip in 3 days. Bromoquinine. These tablets destroy germs, act as a tonic and laxative, and keep the system in condition to throw off attacks of colds, grip, and influenza. Mustarine, for use whenever a hot application is beneficial for aches and pains, headache, simple sore throat, chest colds, lame back, stiff joints or muscles, cold feet, and rheumatic pains. Dr. J.R. Stafford olive tar goes right to inflamed, irritated surfaces of throat, bronchial tubes, and catarrhal glands and brings wonderful relief. Father John's medicine. Taken at the first sign of a cold, it helps you gain strength to fight off a cold that leads to influenza and pneumonia. Smoko tobaccoless cigarettes, a sensible way of relieving grip, influenza, colds, catarrh, hay fever, sore throat. The medicated smoke disinfects the air passages that cannot be reached any other way. Munyon's homeopathic home remedies. James Monroe Munyon had tried his hand at teaching law, social work, publishing, and songwriting before starting his homeopathic home remedy company in the early 1890s. There was a separate remedy for every disease. To name a few, there were Munyon's kidney remedy, which was made up of 100% sugar, Munyon's asthma remedy, containing sugar and alcohol, Munyon's blood cure, containing sugar, Munyon's special liquid blood cure, containing sugar, potassium iodide, and mercury chloride, which was poisonous, Munyon's catarrh cure, baking soda, salt, borax, fennel, and gum is what was contained in that. Munyon's special catarrh cure contained sugar, and Munyon's grip remedy contains sugar and arsenic. California syrup of figs, a children's laxative when peevish, cross, listless, pale, doesn't sleep, doesn't eat or act naturally, or is feverish, stomach sour, breath bad, has stomach ache, sore throat, diarrhea, or full of cold. It's suggested to give it to the child every day. Camphor gum. About an ounce of camphor gum is required to a person. A muslin bag is made, the gum placed in it, and then tied around the neck with a narrow ribbon. Thus, the fumes from the camphor gum may be inhaled. Horlick's malted milk, the diet during and after influenza. Borden's malted milk, a standby for the convalescent. It builds up strength speedily and surely. Bayer tablets of aspirin for colds, headache, grip, influenza, rheumatism, neuralgia, lumbago, and pain. Forcola, approved preventative for influenza, absolutely removes cold, catarrh, etc. Hot lemonade, an acknowledged preventative. Hot lemonade will keep away the flu. Vicks Vapor Rub, one of the best over-the-counter treatments. Vicks, croup, and pneumonia salve have been sold since the 1890s, but when the influenza epidemic of 1918 hit, what was known as Vicks Vapor Rub skyrocketed in sales from 900,000 to 2.9 million in just 1 year. The increase meant that the Vicks plant had to operate day and night to keep up with orders. Advertisements for Vicks Vapor Rub began showing up in local newspapers in October of 1918. But rather than appearing as an ad, the advertisement appeared as a press release with a headline stating, quote, "How to use Vicks Vapor Rub in treating Spanish influenza," end quote. The article usually starts out talking about the symptoms and treatment of influenza and then begins promoting the use of Vapor Rub. The final sentence indicated that 3 sizes were available and cost 30 cents, 60 cents, and $1.20, and is available at all druggists. By October 26, newspaper headlines stated, quote, "Druggists, please note Vicks Vapor Rub oversold due to present epidemic," end quote. And an article said that they had already wiped out a supply that was intended to last until January. The Vicks company called in all salesmen from the field and put them to work helping to fulfill orders. They announced that they would start shipping directly to retailers to save time rather than working through salesmen. This lasted until mid-December, when shipping this way became too expensive, and they reverted back to their former method. The real concern of those who contracted influenza was that it would develop into pneumonia and then result in death, as was the case with Evelyn Richards, a young 30-year-old man who lived on Lombard Street in Towanda with his wife and children. At his death, Mr. Richards' wife and 4 small children were all suffering with the illness. The children were all in critical condition, including a newborn baby named Mabel, but all survived. Mabel ultimately died at the age of 6 from tuberculosis. By this time, the epidemic had killed 30 people in the county, was nearly out of control in Towanda, where there was not enough nurses to make home visits to all those who were ill. On October 17th, it was announced that an emergency hospital would be set up in Towanda. Miss Alice Betts was made chairman and went to work on the details. While St. Agnes School was immediately offered, the committee hoped to instead obtain the use of a building downtown for easier access by doctors as well as supplies and equipment. The Presbyterian Church, located near the courthouse, was chosen as the hospital site. A number of young ladies in Towanda volunteered their time to work under Miss Betts, and any man, woman, boy, or girl willing to help was accepted. The committee appealed to Towanda residents to provide cots, bedding, sheets, pillows, and pillowcases, food supplies, and other necessities. The Reporter Journal in Towanda wrote, quote, "Notwithstanding the report of the local health authorities that the influenza situation is improved in this borough and elsewhere throughout the state, the spread of the disease in the twin towns of Sayre and Athens already has reached alarming proportions. Many victims are dying, and their hospitals, physicians, and nurses alike are rushed by the daily increase in the cases. 1 week ago, less than a score of patients were reported in Sayre. Today, the total is over 700 in that town alone." While Towanda shows no great increase as the towns near the state line, the situation is extremely alarming in this town and in the near vicinity. Elsewhere in the county, the situation is about the same. Hundreds of cases are reported daily, and of these, many are so critical that deaths are occurring daily. Physicians here, too, are overworked and are being pushed to their utmost to handle the cases, end quote. As a precaution to the Towanda Board of Health ordering that Main Street be washed and cleansed to help prevent an increase in the disease. This was done overnight, several blocks having been accomplished. Despite the ban on spitting, the problem seemed to continue. An anonymous letter to the editor of the Towanda Daily Review stated that the writer had gone on a walk to get some fresh air and sunshine. He walked from 3rd Street to Main, then to the end of the bridge and back to Main, then down to Elizabeth Street and back up to 3rd Street. During his walk, the writer discovered 15 large deposits of sputum on the walks. He reminded the public that spitting on the sidewalks was dangerous to public health and that the offender should be taught a lesson by being arrested. The total of sick had now reached 275,000 in Pennsylvania alone. The state urged people to report for duty at their local health authority or Red Cross chapter. They set up 19 districts across the state with medical and nursing officers placed in charge of each district who would report to the Department of Health. 64 emergency hospitals were set up in the districts that were most affected. Communities were told to finance their own relief efforts as much as possible before calling on the state for relief. The governor and other health agencies in a petition wrote, quote, "We call upon the clergy, the press, educators, teachers, and all those molding public opinion to bring to the hearts and minds of our people the gravity and necessity of this appeal," end quote. While Towanda worked to contain the epidemic, Sayre now had 980 cases of influenza reported as of October 17th, a huge increase having happened within one day. Several hundred more cases, it was believed, were not being reported. The day before, only one member of the Sayre police force was able to show up for work, and over 400 employees of the Lehigh Valley Railroad shops were unable to work due to illness. Athens reported 300 cases, and their number was rapidly increasing. An outdoor hospital was set up in the rear of the People's Hospital to tend to influenza victims. These hospitals were tents brought in from Owego with cots furnished by the Lehigh Valley Railroad. 30 nurses and their assistants from the Sayre canteen went to work caring for the continual stream of patients coming in from Sayre, South Waverly, Athens, and surrounding areas. The Sayre canteen building served as the headquarters for those in charge of these temporary hospitals. On October 24th, the emergency hospital in Towanda reported that they were caring for 10 patients, including 2 babies, 3 women, and 5 men. Soup and other food was being prepared in the Presbyterian Church kitchen for patients and sent out to the homes of the ill around town. While they believed that the epidemic was slowing down in Towanda, it took a sudden turn and many new cases along with several deaths were reported. At first, Towanda residents believed the hospital was only for charity cases and not the general public. But once this rumor was dispelled, many people started to flock to the Presbyterian Chapel for treatment. The hospital was divided into a male ward and a female ward and was open day and night. The doors and a window leading into the main auditorium of the church were sealed in order to keep it safe for church members whenever the quarantine was lifted and services resumed. Among those working in the hospital were 3 Sisters of Mercy, volunteers from St. Peter and Paul Church in Towanda. The local chapter of the Red Cross was working in the courthouse basement, making cheesecloth masks for those caring for the sick. The masks were reported to contain several thicknesses of cheesecloth and were oval in shape so as to cover the nose and mouth. Meanwhile, in Monroe, several cases over a 2-week period had ended in death, and the numbers were on the rise. One of the deaths was the 6-week-old daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Clayton Marriott. The funeral for the little child was held in the Monroe Cemetery as her parents were recovering from their own serious attacks of influenza. On a lighter note, the Elmira Star-Gazette reported on October 26th that a dear old lady in the beginning stages of the flu was standing on the Lake Street Bridge in Elmira and sneezed. Her false teeth flew out of her mouth into the water, never to be seen again. Thomas Green of Grover thought himself lucky when he got the flu, since his court trial on the charges of assault and battery and desertion were postponed for a 3rd time while he recovered from the illness. Barbers in Towanda were now wearing masks while cutting hair. Newspapers indicated that by the end of October, the number of new cases of the flu were decreasing. This only served to worsen the problem, however, since the public tended to be more careless in dealing with the epidemic when they thought it was decreasing, leading to more new cases and an increase in numbers. By now, Sayre, for instance, had 1,074 cases, and other towns were on the rise again. Within days, Sayre reached 1,478 cases reported since the beginning of the epidemic. In addition to the influenza, typhoid was appearing here and there in the county. A sad report came on October 23rd from Canton. The two daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Pearl Jones of Grover, aged 10 and 12, had died from typhoid fever within 2 days of each other. It was unknown where they contracted the illness, and the best of medical skill was powerless against it. The parents, in deep mourning, laid their two girls side by side in the same casket, and they were buried in the Grover Cemetery. Just days later, an infant child of Mr. and Mrs. Jones also died. On Sunday morning, December 8th, a memorial service was held in the Grover Church of Christ for the three Jones children. Just 6 months earlier, Mr. Jones nearly lost his life when he was struck by a freight train at the Cedar Ledge Crossing, but was remarkably uninjured. In a strange twist of fate, Mr. Jones was struck by a freight train a second time at Ralston and was killed just 9 years later at the age of 40, leaving a wife and 3 other children. Canton reported on the 26th that influenza remained unchecked in that section and new cases were being reported daily. Many whole families were ill, and the volunteer nursing committee of the Canton chapter of the Red Cross had their hands full taking care of the sick and furnishing meals to families where all were down with the disease. A report soon came that Philadelphia was relaxing its quarantine on public gathering places and that perhaps the same might happen in Bradford County soon. But also, as soon as this report appeared, the State Department of Health warned that, quote, the danger is by no means over, and that the relaxation of vigilance in this care of the thousands of convalescing patients may result in further spread of the disease and a great increased number of deaths, end quote. This is an example of a comic strip that pertained to the influenza epidemic as it appeared in a local newspaper. Poet Edmund Vance Cook wrote a fitting song in 1918. It goes, when your head is blazing, burning, and your brain within is turning into buttermilk from churning, it's the flu. When your joints are creaking, cracking, as if all the fiends were racking, all the devils were attacking, it's the flu. Chorus, it's the flu, 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 which has you. It has caught you and it's got you, and it sticks like glue. It's the very latest fashion, it's the doctor's pet and passion. So sneeze a bit and wheeze a bit, ka-chew, chew, chew. When your stomach grows uneasy, quaking, queerous, and queasy, all dyspeptic and diseasy, it's the flu. When you have appendicitis, parenchymitis, nephritis, laryngitis, or gastritis, it's the flu. When you have a corn, a pimple, complicated, ill, or simple, broken bone, or fading dimple, it's the flu. When no matter what assails you, if no doctor knows what ails you, then the answer never fails you, it's the flu. The Elmira Star-Gazette wrote, quote, you may laugh at the idea that kissing spreads influenza, but have you noticed how many pretty girls have had influenza this year and how many homely ones haven't, end quote. The end of October saw a total of 18 people dead as a result of influenza in Towanda Borough. The ban on school and church gatherings continued. The Towanda saloon keepers and wholesale liquor dealers sent a petition to the health board requesting that the quarantine be lifted or modified for their businesses. The board forwarded the petition to the State Department of Health. While the total number of influenza cases in Sayre had now reached 1,644, the overall number of newly reported cases within the county seemed to be dropping. The Canton Sentinel reminded the public that while people were recovering, not to bother them with phone calls. Quote, people should use the telephone with considerable discretion while this epidemic is on. We have heard of a case where the nurse in charge answered the telephone 21 times during one afternoon to assure anxious inquirers that everything is all right and the patient is as well as can be expected. And each time was told, well, tell her that I inquired and that I would like to do something for her, but I don't see how I can because I have to look after the children so close. And each time the nurse had to come downstairs to answer because the doctor had told her that he would call up sometime during the afternoon to give further directions. When there is sickness in the house, the jingle of the telephone bell is not particularly soothing to the sick one, and every unnecessary step counts. Towanda, Troy, Canton, and other towns in the county were accepting donations of food to help those who were ill or to help those families who were unable to cook due to multiple cases of illness. Donations of fruit and eggs were being received at the hospital inside the Presbyterian Church Chapel in Towanda. Residents of Troy delivered the jellies, canned fruits, baked goods, and other food to this hospital as well. On November 1st, the emergency hospital in Towanda reported no new patients for the first time in 2 weeks. Even so, the physicians of Towanda reported that evening that it would be, quote, improper and extremely unwise to lift the quarantine on schools and churches, end quote. As conditions in Towanda seemed to be improving, news came from the lumber town of Lakeland along the Susquehanna-New York Railroad on Barkley Mountain that an epidemic of serious proportions had gripped the town and that several residents had already died. Extreme measures were taken to stop the spread of the epidemic. The officials of the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company, who were then operating the sawmill there, appealed to Dr. C.S. Means of Towanda for assistance. Dr. Means secured 2 nurses from Smithfield Township who had just returned from Pittsburgh to travel with him to Lakeland. The emergency hospital tents that had been used at Sayre were taken down and shipped by railroad to Lakeland in order to establish a hospital on the mountain. Other nearby towns were also providing relief. The Towanda Red Cross branch sent a truckload of supplies and bedding for use of the patients in Lakeland. Little immediate progress was made in the fight against influenza there, and the head nurse of the Lakeland Emergency Hospital was reported to have collapsed from the nervous strain of the past several days. They found it difficult to find a worker to take her place. On Monday, November 4th, 1918, the local health board issued a notice that the influenza quarantine would be partially lifted throughout Bradford County on Thursday, November 7th. This allowed for the reopening of theaters, but not schools, churches, or liquor establishments. On the 5th, this was changed with a complete lifting of the quarantine by Dr. B. Franklin Royer, acting health commissioner in Pennsylvania. The local health board agreed, except that all funerals would have to remain private for another week, no matter what the cause of death had been. Students coming from families where active cases of the flu had recently been reported were also not permitted to attend school sessions. The St. Agnes School delayed their reopening from Thursday to the following Monday to give the Sisters of Mercy adequate time to rest after having worked tirelessly in the local emergency hospital. The local theaters were being cleaned and fumigated prior to opening, just to be safe. The churches in Canton were set to open on November 10th, except for the Methodist Episcopal Church, where the Canton branch of the Red Cross had set up an emergency hospital in the basement of the building. While the hospital was in operation, the congregation of the Methodist Episcopal Church would meet in the Presbyterian Church in Canton for services. The emergency hospital had been started October 29th with only a few hours' notice, and they transformed the parlors of the Methodist Episcopal Church into a credible hospital ward. Miss Lula Cole was in charge. The hospital had 30 beds and 11 patients were moved in at once. A total of 17 were treated there. Of these, 3 died. Miss Gertrude Innes, dietitian for the Canton branch of the Red Cross, arranged for the cooking and serving of meals. Of 260 meals prepared, 241 portions of soups, jellies, and custard were delivered by nurses to the sick. The food was prepared and donated by private families. Many others were treated in their own homes. Dr. Harold Stem in 1942 remembered his experiences as one of Canton's doctors during the epidemic. He wrote, quote, "The doctors discontinued office practice and just made house calls. Cases came down so fast it was sometimes 2 or 3 days before new cases could be reached. We used automobiles when we could, but storms made the dirt roads almost impassable, and most of these calls were made by horse and buggy. We had drivers and practically slept on the road or took a nap in the house of a patient we were particularly worried about. While the epidemic was at its worst, a heavy snow blocked travel, and the doctors were forced to walk miles to reach patients." End quote. On November 20th, it was reported that the emergency hospital in Canton had been closed and that Methodist services would continue in their own building November 24th. Pastor M.A. Soper submitted to the Canton Sentinel a notice that appeared on November 21st. Quote, "The pastor wishes to announce that the Methodist Church has been twice fumigated thoroughly, upstairs and down, and regular services will resume next Sunday. We have been glad to be of service to the sick during the epidemic, and now expect the loyal backing of the church for a strong move forward." The decision as to whether to lift the quarantine at Lakeland was left up to officials there to decide. New cases were still being reported. The Red Cross Auxiliary at Lakeland was devoting practically its entire time to the relief of the sufferers and felt that they had at least had the epidemic under control. Officials reported that the emergency hospital had been established in the large boarding house of the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company, and that practically all of the Red Cross work was being done in the building. The town was canvassed for bed linens, pillows, and other items, while the women of the town quickly made garments and towels. 15 beds were provided in the hospital, and additional room was available as needed. Dr. Carpenter, formerly of Troy, and Dr. Kenyon of Monroton were caring for the patients. Those willing to provide aid were instructed to contact Charles Werner at the Lakeland Store Company office. World War I, or the Great War, ended with the armistice on November 11th, 1918, and a sobering fact soon came to light. More people had already died as a result of the influenza epidemic than died in all of World War I. The newspapers at the time reported that nearly 40,000 people had died in Pennsylvania alone during the epidemic, and 400,000 in the United States. The United States Army estimated that 20,000 soldiers died in military camps throughout the nation during the epidemic. An estimated 50,000 children in Pennsylvania alone had been orphaned by the death of parents due to influenza. In comparison, they estimated that around 55,000 Americans had been killed during the war. The Visiting Nurse Association, who began meeting in the courthouse, reported that Mrs. McCabe had under her care 187 influenza cases. Miss Blight and Mrs. Herbert made 201 visits, taking food cooked in the emergency hospital and in private homes to 125 patients, making in all 618 meals carried by them. Mid-November brought an increase in influenza cases in Towanda, with several more deaths. Despite this, the quarantine had been lifted statewide, and Towanda followed suit. Local doctors were of the opinion that the cases of the flu would come and go throughout the coming winter. Nevertheless, the emergency hospital in the Presbyterian Church in Towanda was closed at the end of November after having treated 76 patients over more than 6 weeks. Of those 76, there were 56 cases of influenza, 18 cases of pneumonia, 1 case of diphtheria, and 1 case of typhoid pneumonia. Out of those cases, a total of 9 patients died in the hospital. 2/3 of the pneumonia patients and all of the influenza patients were discharged in good health. This was considered an excellent record compared to other towns. The Presbyterian congregation had gone 7 consecutive Sundays without holding services in the building while the hospital was in operation. Although the auditorium of the church had been hermetically sealed off from the chapel area where Sunday school was normally held and where the hospital had operated, the church fumigated the entire building, and the minister, Reverend Dean N. Dobson, consulted 5 physicians as to the safety of using the church. All agreed that there was no danger. The church opened for regular services on November 24th. The Towanda School Board, that same weekend made a decision to suspend the usual 2-week Christmas vacation provided to its students and to only provide 3 days in total. No time off would be given for New Year's. This decision was necessary due to the time lost during the epidemic. The Athens Borough Schools tried to no avail to have the annual Bradford County Teachers Institute at Towanda canceled in order to make up time lost. The Athens School Board believed that they could bring school to a close for the year by June 13th by not allowing any more holidays after Christmas vacation. Officials refused, and the schools were forced to lose more time, specifically December 16th through the 23rd, while teachers attended Institute. The Bradford County Teachers Institute minutes for December 16th, 1918 stated, quote, "There had been an epidemic of influenza throughout the county, and many teachers having great fear thereof, at the suggestion of the county superintendent and also acting on the advice of the State Health Board, many teachers were excused from attendance at the sessions of the Institute," end quote. In the afternoon session at 2 p.m., it was written, quote, "Superintendent L.J. Russell then made an announcement excusing from the Institute all teachers coming from homes having the flu and all those who were in great fear of contracting it at the sessions of the Institute." He further said, "We planned to have this institute in October, but our plans were upset by an order of the local Board of Health of Towanda Borough, which at that time passed resolutions closing the public schools, churches, and Sunday schools. We have rearranged the program as far as possible and have been able to bring to you this week the majority of the instructors and lecturers. Some of them we have not been able to get," end quote. The Canton branch of the Red Cross submitted their final report for publication in the Canton Sentinel on November 28th. From October 18th to November 10th, there were 550 cases of influenza in Canton, and the district visited by Canton physicians, which later rose to 1,500. There were 17 deaths, 30 families were assisted in their homes. A long list of women who spent time working in the hospital was printed. The newspaper reported, quote, "The list of people who cooked and gave food is a list of nearly all the families in town that were not sick. The editor says it is too long to publish. We could publish a short list of people who in town who did nothing in this time of general suffering, but we are too kind to do that." The flu continued to show itself in random communities throughout the county, but the strain was not nearly as deadly as it had been. It was reported on November 26th that Camptown canceled a play due to the influenza epidemic going on there. Other events at Camptown were canceled in December as new cases of the flu were reported. Meanwhile, LeRoy was dealing with an outbreak of the measles, and other cases of the measles were showing up in the northern part of the county, just another inconvenience to a county trying to recover. The Reporter-Journal reported the sad deaths of sisters Helen Campbell Hunsinger, age 18, and Dora Campbell Beach, age 22, the two oldest daughters of Mr. and Mrs. J.W. Beach of Troy. The two women contracted influenza on November 23rd, which ultimately turned into pneumonia and resulted in their deaths on December 2nd, only a few hours apart. Helen had just married Frank Hunsinger of West Burlington in August. As the couple had planned to start housekeeping soon, she had returned to the home of her parents to complete some sewing. Her sister Dora, who had been married 3 years, and her mother were aiding in the work and had completed 2 quilts when the entire household was stricken with influenza. The service and interment was made in the Glenwood Cemetery in Troy, Helen and Dora being placed side by side in the same grave. By mid-December, health officials assumed that new cases of influenza would continue to decline due to the cold weather. But weather conditions were too changeable, and it was reported that this caused an alarming increase in new cases. On December 16th, about 100 employees of the Ingersoll Rand Company had been stricken with the disease, just in time for the Teachers Institute, when children would be on vacation and playing in the streets. The Board of Health ordered all Athens children off the streets and furthermore prevented them from congregating at all during vacation due to the threat. The same week, the family of Ezra Maynard near Ulster were reported to have been ill for 2 weeks. Mr. and Mrs. Maynard and the 2 children first came down with influenza, and when Mrs. Maynard's parents came to care for them, they also contracted the disease. A nurse came to attend to the family, and she too became sick. This made 7 people ill with no one to care for them until Dr. Daly took them under his care, and all recovered. On December 19th, the Canton Sentinel reported that the quarantine was back on again, and all children and all churches, schools, theaters, and dance halls in their town would be closed until further notice. As in other places, the strain of influenza this time around seemed weaker and was not followed by pneumonia. But influenza was on the rise, and this time the community of Troy, Herrick, and Rome were in a full epidemic. The businesses of Towanda, however, were busy with the approach of Christmas. With the war ending, soldiers coming home, and the epidemic in the borough coming to an end, local residents were out shopping. People wanted to buy food that they had been restricted from buying during the war. They wanted to make the holiday especially delightful this year. Every business, no matter what they sold, was having the best season on record. The Daily Review wrote, quote, "Never in the history of Towanda has money been so plentiful, and never before have people been so free with their money as this season. The jeweler, the clothier, the grocer, the boot and shoe men, and even the druggist are reported to have reaped a harvest this year," end quote. Sales of boxed candy were up, lunchrooms were busy, bookstores, cigar stores, plumbing shops, you name it. They were making money faster than they could keep up, and people were spending more than they usually did. When the schools in Towanda reopened after the holiday, numerous children were absent. Professor Quackenbush attributed this to a successful holiday and turkey dinner and praised the students who did show up for classes because of their love of study and teachers. Because of the recent epidemic, he stressed how important it was for each pupil to attend every session of school. As the calendar turned over to 1919, Bradford County was trying to recover from the epidemic of the previous year. The government advised people to burn wood instead of coal for their heat during the remainder of the winter. Influenza had affected the coal miners in Pennsylvania's anthracite country as much as anywhere, and this meant that coal production had taken a hit. Education about influenza and its treatment continued to appear in the newspapers. The Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense of Pennsylvania were advertising for information on those children orphaned during the epidemic. A Tioga County agent for children advertised that it was seeking a home for a 7-month-old baby whose mother had died of influenza. Canton passed an ordinance prohibiting public gatherings during an epidemic of influenza, while the Canton branch of the Red Cross was working to hire a community nurse, a need made clear during the epidemic. While influenza continued to affect the nation on a less serious level, Bradford County had seen the worst of the epidemic locally. In June 1919, the Board of Trustees of the Robert Packer Hospital met for their annual meeting. In his report, Superintendent H.E. Bishop described the conditions at the hospital during the epidemic. Quote, "At the beginning of the year, the hospital had become fairly well adjusted to the conditions brought about by the war. The work of the hospital had been divided up, and though short-handed in both doctors and nurses, and though we had but one intern, we were getting along well until the epidemic of influenza in September. Dr. Guthrie was one of the first to be taken sick while he was in Philadelphia. His attack of influenza was followed by pneumonia, and he was critically ill. We are very fortunate that his life was spared and that he was able to return to Packer Hospital. The slight falling off in the number of patients treated was due, I believe, to Dr. Guthrie's absence from the hospital during his illness. During the epidemic, it was found necessary to treat cases of influenza in this hospital, and in all, over 300 cases were treated. We had nearly 100 cases of influenza in the hospital at one time, and this necessitated isolating over half the hospital. The work of the doctors and nurses, and in fact all connected with the institution, showed plainly their spirit of loyalty to the hospital. It would be difficult to speak too highly of their work. Several doctors and nurses were ill, but refusing to give up their work, insisted on helping to take care of others. 17 of our nurses were off duty at one time, and naturally the demands on the rest were very great. Through it all, I heard no word of complaint, although there were weeks during that time that the hours of work were nearly doubled what they should have been. I wish to take this opportunity to thank each member of our staff of doctors and nurses and each employee who gave their services so willingly in the emergency, and I also want to thank the ladies of our auxiliaries who worked at that critical time when we found it impossible to get help to come in owing to the fear of the influenza." End quote. The influenza epidemic would eventually infect an estimated 500 million people worldwide. A total of 650,000 Americans and 20 million to 50 million people around the world would die. Far greater numbers of Americans than were lost in all World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Due to its global impact, this event is today referred to as the Influenza Pandemic of 1918. Through service and self-sacrifice, Bradford County's people recovered from one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history, and it happened 100 years ago this fall. Thank you.